I want to share with you an experience I had in an apartment I lived in about 2 years ago. When I was house hunting, I was looking for a place which was cheap, and I didn't mind a place that had a bit of an edge to it, you know? A real estate company was keen to show me an apartment. It was pretty small, but it had a loft, nice sun coverage too. The cool thing about the place was the vast amount of storage space that it offered due to the high ceilings, and it was in a great location. I literally had no complaints, so I went ahead and told them that I'd take the apartment right there on the spot. Man, was that a mistake. Back then I had a cat, and I'm going to be completely honest and hold my hands up here and say I forgot to let them know I had a pet. In my defense, I was never asked. I felt guilty about it, but I didn't want to lose this great new place or give up my cat. It was tough. I thought for all parties involved, it might just be best for me to keep my mouth shut and see if anyone noticed. After meeting some of the residents and introducing myself, I went to take a look around the area to see what was available. I wanted to acclimate myself and find my go-to stores. I liked the neighbors. They were welcoming. After all the moving in was done, I was exhausted, so that night I didn't unpack anything but the bare essentials. My cat was acting pretty weird. She was by the front door and hissing occasionally. I put this down to her being in a new place, so I didn't pay it much mind. But then my cat did this kind of lower groaning voice. I'm sure you're familiar with the sound I'm trying to describe. And that weirded me out because she doesn't usually do that. I guessed that there might be another cat in the area or something like that, so I tried to ignore it and get some sleep. I went to sleep pretty quickly due to the move. My cat wouldn't stop this low growling night after night, so one night I tiptoed over to her and tried to figure out what was upsetting her. I knew that there was something on the other side of that door. I'm not talking about something supernatural, I'm talking about a human. You know when you see the shadowy outline of feet in the gap beneath the door? Yeah, that's what I saw that night. I really wanted to throw the door open and confront whoever was out there, but the risks were too great, and I didn't feel safe. Whoever was out there wasn't a normal person. Who stands in front of someone's door in the dead of night? Who does that? I was really terrified. I was living alone as a young female, and someone was out there for reasons unknown to me. The only thing I could do was head back to my bedroom with my cat and hide out till the morning. My cat kept on growling, and I barely slept that night. From then on, sleep was hard to come by, so I wanted to get out of that apartment. But I was locked into a long-term deal that I couldn't get out of without losing a load of money. I didn't have any family to turn to either. I knew that I would be able to move in 3 months, so I just held on to that. I was so stressed out by the situation, I went to see a doctor, and he told me that I was suffering from stress. I had lost weight too. I stayed with a friend for a couple of days until I was a burden, and then I went back to my apartment. I decided to show my face around in the apartment complex more, in the hope that I would get along better with my neighbors. Also, I wanted them to know that I was okay just in case they were worrying about me. I said hello as I bumped into them, and I was shocked to realize that every single one of them ended up in one way or another talking about my cat or cats in general. Let me give you a couple of examples. Oh, you know cats aren't allowed in this building, right? It's crazy, right? Well, I just thought that you should know. I wouldn't dream of bringing a pet in here without the landlord's approval. I'm sure you feel the same. This is funny. Did you know that the landlord hates cats? I couldn't believe it at first. Did you know that? I never took my cat out of my room. She's an indoor cat. How on earth did they know? It's not like she was causing any trouble either. I'm a proud cat owner and I really took care of her. I was sick of these not-so-subtle comments, so when the next person asked me, I replied, "How did you know I have a cat?" I thought that they were going to feign ignorance, but my neighbor's reply shocked me. Because we all took turns watching. This is where the story gets absolutely mad. Apparently the landlord ordered the other residents to keep an eye on me. My neighbor said that the second I returned home from work, someone was ordered to keep watch. The creepiest thing about this was the fact that she wasn't even embarrassed or found it strange that she was ordered to do this. She proudly and smugly said to me that she found my cat when she lifted up the mail slot to look inside my apartment. I argued back that this was a complete invasion of my privacy, and it was all totally insane. All of my arguments were met with the same reply. We were only doing what the landlord told us. It was a total regime and deeply disturbing. This landlord had them all brainwashed. Since this neighbor of mine was content to tell me everything, I asked more and more, and her smug smile widened each time she knew it was getting to me. The landlord even told them to go through my mail to find out more about me. When I heard that, I decided that enough was enough. I called the real estate company immediately and told them I was leaving, and thankfully, they were sympathetic. I didn't lose any money. I now knew why such a great place in a great location was so cheap. I guess I can laugh about it now and it's a story to tell, but I still find it deeply disturbing. Nowadays I'm in a better place, no weirdos outside, no issues with pets, and no insane landlord. Sometimes a good place is worth the price, and if something is too good to be true, it usually is because it isn't.
This is a story that I heard from my mother. This happened when she was single and living alone. Back in those days, she was working in an office job. Next door, to the right, lived a single man who was living alone, and from the start, Mom always thought that he was kind of weird. He would never offer any form of greeting when they ran into one another in the hall. She would often say hello to him, but he never replied, and that's why my mom was a bit wary of him. Also, another off-putting fact about the guy next door was the fact that he would just stare at her. She said that she had a bad feeling about that guy. One night, she awoke from a dream in the dead of night. She said it was as if a switch had been flipped somewhere. Her reaction was instantaneous. She opened her eyes and was fully conscious. And just as mysteriously as she awoken, a question jumped to the forefront of her mind. Did I lock the door? After the intrusive question entered her mind, she couldn't make it leave. It lingered, and worry began to set in as she lay in bed in the dark. Like an itch that needs scratching, she felt as if she had to go and check. She crept over to the door and realized that the door was unlocked, just as she feared. She blamed it on her own carelessness, then turned the key and locked the door. In that exact moment, she felt the doorknob slowly and slightly twist in her hand. She was incredibly frightened, but she managed to maintain her composure and keep quiet. She had only just turned the key in the door, and had she hesitated even a second longer, the person on the other side of the door would have been opening an unlocked door. She put her eye to the peephole and saw the figure of a man outside. She recognized him almost instantly as the neighbor next door. She covered her mouth so as not to scream as the doorknob slowly turned once again. A few agonizing seconds crawled by, and then her neighbor gave up and walked away. My mom has a trusting kind of nature, so she decided that she would put this down as her neighbor making an honest mistake and mistaking his apartment for hers. She decided not to worry about it. A couple of days went by, and her neighbor moved out of the apartment complex. It was around the same time as my mom wanting to move out too. She began cleaning and packing her things away when she noticed something. She was cleaning one of her balcony windows at the time, and it was partially fogged up in the right corner. Upon closer inspection, she saw fingerprints on the glass. The fingerprints were on the outside of the balcony window. She didn't know how they could have gotten there at first, but then she remembered something. Her creepy neighbor lived on the right-hand side, and that was where she found the fingerprints. There had to be a connection. She stepped out onto her balcony and took a look at the railing, and there were traces of fingerprints there too. It looked as if the man next door was climbing over the balcony partition and peering into her apartment. My mom laughed when she told me this story. She literally never gets up at night. She's a total sound sleeper. But that night, intuition kicked in and made her make sure the door was locked. I think that she's only still here today because of that gut feeling that she had to go and check that that door was locked. If you wake up with a similar concern, get up. There's one thing that still freaks me out. If the neighbor got the apartment wrong, why didn't he just try to put his key in the lock? Why did he just silently turn the door handle? It freaks me out to imagine what her neighbor's intentions were.
When I was in university, I was living alone, and I wasn't living in a dorm. I wanted to live by myself, and to do so, I needed to find the cheapest place to live I could. Being a student meant that I had like zero money, but somehow I managed to find a place within my price range. I had a part-time job, which helped. I loved the place I ended up moving into. It seemed like a steal. However, the day after I moved in, I felt that something was off. Being in that apartment made me feel down, you know? As if I was really upset. It made my heart feel heavy. I'm not sure if that makes much sense, but that's just how I felt. I would literally cry for no reason. It was bizarre, and I would often end up crying at night. I thought that it could have been caused by hay fever since this happened in spring. I didn't pay it much mind, as I was too interested in starting my new life in a new place. About a week or 10 days go by, and then I became aware of a noise at around midnight each night. I thought that it was a bug, maybe a mosquito, but that wasn't it. Then I thought it could have been a mechanical sound, like that of a fan or a refrigerator. But I knew that that wasn't it either. Then it became clear that what I was hearing was a low, sobbing sound. It sounded as if someone was crying nearby. After a while, I determined that the owner of that voice was a female. Was one of my neighbors crying? I asked myself. I thought that it was strange since the crying started at about the same time each night. Surely no one cries every single night, right? Plus, I didn't think my neighbor was a woman. As the nights went on by, I began to think that the sound was coming from inside my apartment. No matter how many times I searched my apartment, I couldn't find the source of that sound. I remember standing in the bedroom, hearing that sound and asking myself, how much longer can I stay here? It was scary, but I was trying to keep my head. I know that in life, most things have a logical explanation. I just couldn't find that explanation. The mind is a problem-solving device. When it is confronted with an unanswerable puzzle of this nature, then fear begins to settle in. Well, it did for me anyway. I rarely cry. I never really feel down. And I haven't suffered with depression, so this feeling I got when I was in my apartment, coupled with the crying sound, was completely alien to me. I decided that the best thing I could do would be to move on. The energy in that room was too heavy for me. On the day I was moving out, I was carrying out some boxes, and I ran into one of my neighbors. I had barely spoken to the guy before. He stopped, looked at me and said, "You're moving out too? No one ever stays in that apartment long." I asked him what he meant. "In that apartment, about 5 years ago, a young woman died. She was a lonely person." I pressed him for more information because at first I thought he was just messing with me. I thought he mistook me for a naive youngster. So apparently, the woman was in her 20s. She never married, never had guests or spoke of any family. One day, the landlord noticed that he hadn't seen her around, and she hadn't responded to any of his messages, so he went to see if she was okay. And that was when he discovered her. He said that he didn't think that it was a suicide, rather a sudden death. The neighbor said that ever since that apartment has been rented, no one has lasted over a month there. He had so many neighbors ask him about the person crying in the night and if it was coming from his apartment. One former resident described the apartment as cursed. After moving out, I went back to my old self, and life went on for me quite normally. I ended up moving back to my hometown, but sometimes I think about that apartment and that poor woman.
This happened over 10 years ago. I lived in the outskirts of the city. The town wasn't exactly small, but not big at all. The population was pretty low. There was nothing but fields, and all the streets, houses, and neighborhoods, they all looked the same. I grew up in that town, and as early as I could remember, I wanted to get the hell out of it. It's a very stifling place. Not to mention, there was pretty much nothing to do there. There was an odd vibe in that town. First of all, there was zero privacy. I've never lived in a place like it since, but it was the town where anyone in the neighborhood could just walk on into your house if they felt like it. For example, there would be people who would just turn up. They'd had an argument with their partner, needed a place to escape. Someone who needed someone to talk to about a marriage proposal, or just someone who was passing through who might need to use the bathroom. Oh, it was great. Everyone knew everyone's business. I was eager to limit any rumors about me, so at all hours of the day, my curtains were shut, and I kept things quiet. Of course, I wasn't up to anything, or trying to hide something. And on the surface, when I spoke to people in the town, I was polite. I just didn't want any drama. A few things happened in that town, but none stood out more than the one I'm about to tell you. It started one day when I was planning a trip with my husband. He was content to stay home and just relax, but I wanted to get out of that town. So we compromised and decided to get a hotel with a spa not too far away. A couple of days into the trip and things were going great. But on the third day, his work calls and he has to go back into the office. It couldn't have been helped. I was naturally annoyed by this time, but I tried to remain supportive. He said that I should just stay at the hotel and enjoy the rest of the trip solo. I didn't think that that would be much fun by myself, so I told him that I'd be going back with him. When we arrived back at our house, I sensed that something was off. There was something not right that I couldn't immediately put my finger on. I stood there looking around the living room, and I noticed that some of the furniture was slightly out of place, and little things like a book or a magazine on the table were in a new position. I hated that feeling. Considering the way people behaved in this small town, I could only assume that someone might have been in there. I went from room to room checking, and as I was pacing the upstairs hallway, I heard the front door creak open below. This was at about 2 p.m. I thought that it could have been my husband wandering in after bringing the luggage in or something. I called out and asked him if he needed my help. I came rushing down the stairs to help, and I was shocked to see the woman who lived 3 houses away standing in my home. "Oh, wow, welcome back." Hey, I walked on in because the door looked like it was unlocked, and you can never be too careful, right? She said something like that. I can't remember what her exact words were, but I knew she seemed flustered. And if I didn't know better, she acted as if I'd caught her red-handed somehow. I swear I saw her blush. The door looked unlocked? Is that a normal thing that people say? That, coupled with the furniture in a different area, led me to believe that this wasn't the first time that she'd come to our home when we were out. I don't know how whoever, probably her, got into our home while we were away, but I couldn't stand living there after that day. Anyway, we moved out of the area shortly after that. I couldn't live in that place any longer. I felt really creeped out knowing that someone I barely knew had been in my home and lied about it to my face. I live in a different place, and it's a much calmer environment. And we didn't share any details with our neighbors about our new address.
This happened when I moved to the west of Tokyo. The apartment that I moved into was about 2 years old. It was a very ordinary looking place. I lived on the 2nd floor in the last apartment on the left. Back in those days, I was free and single. I was working freelance, and I barely left my apartment. I would only leave to go to meetings. It was pretty hard back then, with an unstable income and rent piling up. I was stressed out. I guessed from the outside it looked like I was someone with a ton of time on their hands. I might have even looked as if I was unemployed. I was just perpetually wandering around the apartment block. I was always there. To be honest, I sensed some prejudice about my lifestyle from the landlord from the moment I moved in. When I moved in, I brought some cakes and thought that I'd stop by and introduce myself to the neighbors. You know, let them know that I was home even in the daytime if they needed anything. I guess I hoped that that would make them conscious of my work-home life, and perhaps that would encourage them to, I don't know, maybe keep it down a little while I was working. So I went to the apartment next to mine first. Next door was a couple. The guy was a blue-collar worker, he was in the construction trade, and his wife also was working. They were a really nice couple. They were good neighbors, and they never caused me any trouble. I got along with them. Without sounding mean, they were the best type of neighbors you could hope for since they were so ordinary. Next, I thought I would pay a visit to whoever was living downstairs. No matter how many times I went down there, they just weren't home. At first I thought the apartment below was vacant, but something changed to make me think otherwise. The apartment complex wasn't exactly cheap, but noises from neighbors could be heard. I mean, I would always know when someone was watching TV too loudly. I heard noise coming from downstairs, footsteps, and everyday household noises. When I heard this kind of noise, I went down to introduce myself, but no one answered the door. I got the strangest feeling that someone was watching me through the peephole. I mean, I can't be certain, but it felt like that. I can understand if someone is out, but to constantly pretend that you're not home when someone comes to the door is a bit weird, I guess. According to the landlord, the people who lived downstairs were another young couple. The guy was an office worker and his wife was a housewife. It was obvious that they were ignoring me when I rang the doorbell, and that annoyed me. Then, finally, a full week after I had moved in, I saw their door open as I was passing on the stairs. I thought, great, finally I get a chance to see this stubborn asshole. I was surprised to see a timid, nervous-looking man scuttling towards his front door. He wasn't what I expected. As the door opened, I saw his wife standing in the kitchen. She saw me and looked my way. I guess she must have recognized me from the peephole. She was short and plump, with a dated short hairstyle. She was holding a baby close to her chest and she was wearing an apron. I gave her a slight nod to say hello, but I couldn't keep eye contact with her. She was staring at me with a blank expression. On reflection, I now understood why they were reluctant to answer the door. She was home alone with a newborn, and I was a total stranger. I thought that I would just leave them alone. I didn't want to come across like a creeper, and I felt a bit bad for bothering them so much. Life in my new apartment went on peacefully from that day. I was engrossed in my work one afternoon when I heard a thud coming from below. It felt and sounded like someone downstairs jabbed their ceiling with a pole or a stick. A couple of raps came in quick succession. It was as if I was being told to keep it down, but I wasn't making any noise or listening to music. It sounded angry. The floor wasn't exactly thick, so with the power behind those jabs that they were hitting, I thought that before long it would create a hole. The intervals between each blast were getting shorter and shorter. What the hell was this? When I listened a bit more closely, I heard that there were other sounds coming from downstairs. It sounded as if something heavy was being thrown against the wall, too. There was some muttering, too, and then all the crashing and banging sounds ceased. This all happened on a weekday, at around lunchtime. It didn't sound like a domestic argument, and I guessed that the guy was at work. It honestly just sounded as if it was directed at me, and I hadn't been making noise. Well, the banging against my floor wasn't a one-off, unfortunately. It happened a lot. Sometimes I would hear cupboards and doors slam down there too. The noises from downstairs always happened on a weekday. At daytime, never on the weekends. They never lasted too long, but they sounded very aggressive. I guess because I was the only person working at home, I was the only one who noticed these noises and heard them. I got the strong impression, based on my interactions with the landlord, that if I complained about these outbursts, then I would be further ostracized. I thought that he would think of me as just some young guy who's always at home looking for areas to complain. I knew he would stereotype me as a lazy student, just because I was working in an unconventional way. The noise from downstairs wasn't daily, but it was frequent. The sounds that were coming out of her mouth from down there were really disturbing, like she was speaking some long-dead language. It didn't make sense. It sounded as if it was coming from the pit of her stomach, like this guttural sound leaking out through her clenched teeth. Before I knew it, strange moans and screams rose from down below, and the banging and slamming got worse. Enough was enough. I decided to call the landlord and told him about what was going on. Just as I expected, he brushed off my comments by saying, "Well, no one else has said anything, so..." I knew he lived on the outside of town, so I couldn't imagine that he would be interested in coming over unless something was absolutely urgent. I didn't care that nobody else had said anything. I was saying something. I hated his attitude. One day, her noise was really ridiculous, so I went downstairs and pretended to get something from my car. Then I tried to take a sneak peek into their apartment, but their curtains were closed, so I couldn't see anything. Then all of a sudden, it was as if she sensed my presence, because she stopped all her banging and screaming. I learned something while I was down there, that her screams were not screams of anger or irritation, they were just nonsensical, and that really creeped me out. I thought she was a complete weirdo, but I couldn't help myself. From that day forward, I continued to listen to her. I would even hold my breath to try and make out what she was screaming about. I couldn't decipher any words at first. But then after a while, I don't know how many days or weeks, I was able to make out something.
You spoiled brat. Look what you made me do. I could kill you.
I couldn't help but think of that baby she was holding tightly against her chest, and my heart wept. Could this be abuse? I heard other things I dare not repeat, but the gist of it was that she was angry that the baby wasn't eating. Is this why she's been screaming and banging around down there? I knew I needed to report it, but I needed to get my story straight, and at least gather some evidence of what I assumed to be going on down there. I didn't want to cause a fuss if I wasn't going to be listened to, and given the attitude of my landlord, I was more apprehensive than I should have been. While I was mulling this over, a jarring thought burst to the forefront of my mind, and that thought was, why haven't I ever heard the baby crying? I was really worried now. I felt so helpless, but I knew I needed to do something. Then, moments later, I heard a different sound. I crept out of my apartment and looked down from the top of the corridor stairs. A moving truck was idling its engine out in the communal parking lot. I guessed that her husband or the pair of them were moving out. My theory was confirmed when I looked out of the window to see him carrying a cardboard box to the truck. His wife wasn't helping with the boxes. She just stood there staring, an absent stare, beside what I assumed was their family car. Her hair looked oily. She looked as if she hadn't washed for a long time. Her shoulders were slumped, and she seemed to be unaware of her surroundings. She was wearing the same apron I saw her wearing last time I saw her. There was her baby, still pulled tightly to her chest. I couldn't see everything from where I was, but at least the baby looked okay. I wondered if my imagination had run away from me. Back then I didn't know anything about raising a baby or their situation. I saw the baby in her arms opening and closing its eyes. I was so relieved that the baby was okay. I caught a better glimpse of the baby's face, and I was shocked to see that its expression was similar to its mother's, completely blank. Something felt wrong here, but like I said, I didn't know their situation, and I felt really bad for judging them if they were just going through a tough time, and they were getting ready to depart. I don't know why, but I just kept watching them. Her husband called her over to the truck, and she approached, and that's when I saw something that changed everything. When she was climbing into the truck, she bumped the side of the baby's head against the doorframe. I knew that her husband saw it. There was no way that he didn't. I could even see it from where I was. I was so angry in that moment. I began storming downstairs and into the parking lot. As I drew closer to their car, the baby's face was reflected in the sunlight, and its eyes gleamed. The only part of the baby that was moving was its eyelids, and that only happened when she moved her arms. I knew then that it wasn't a baby. It was obviously a doll, and I'm so thankful it was.